In some countries, it's long hours. It's your availability, that you are available, that you are showing your face at team events outside of working hours.
Mhm.
And in Denmark, it will be almost the opposite. Being hardworking means delivering efficiently within the agreed hours.
Hi, this is Anna Kostecka. Welcome to What Works Across Cultures, my podcast on the art and science of global leadership and teamwork. I've explored this topic for over 15 years. Now I'm bringing experts from all around the world to talk about how culture shapes the way we lead, communicate, and collaborate. And of course, what works across cultures. Join our conversation. Welcome. In this episode, we'll talk about how culture impacts our understanding and expectations of work-life balance. As always, I start with a short disclaimer. We are going to talk about cultural differences, and these are patterns in how people tend to behave and make sense of behaviors of others. And just to be clear, this does not mean that everyone will act in the same way. Let's remember that people are complex and culture is just one of many factors that impact how we behave and think. Today, I invited Ekaterina von Gertten. Katja has been leading the global diversity, equity, and inclusion agenda at GN Group. And before that, she spent years partnering with Fortune 100 companies, helping them make global collaboration work, either after a merger between headquarters and regional offices, or in a leadership team spread across different geographies. Along the way, Katja also coached people through some of the biggest international moves. So professionals heading on an assignment or returning home, which might be as difficult. But also you work with partners and families that move with them and whose journeys is often as profound as the primer person for whom they move, but is often overlooked. So I'm really, really happy to have you here on the podcast with me. Would you like to add something to this introduction?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, Anna. I think that the introduction pretty much covers it. The only thing is that I think there is one piece of work that is very, very important for me and that I'm doing pro bono, and that is that I'm coaching refugees or those who move for other reasons other than business reasons or work reasons, because their life journeys and their lives are changed very often by the move in the ways that they cannot predict. And those are the moves that they are not choosing themselves. So for me, supporting them through this is very important.
Amazing that you're doing this work. I have to tell you that you have one of the most interesting LinkedIn profiles that I have seen. Interesting in the sense of like very unconventional. For example, I like how you wrote, instead of just listing the languages that you speak, you wrote that you work in English, live your daily life in Swedish, and breathe the air in Belarusian. And you also included like experiences like opera soloist and a full-time career break. And you wrote, I think let me look at my notes, after your second child, that you completed additional courses on team leadership, conflict management, and inspirational talks. Upon completion, one gets the badge. If I can manage this, I can manage anything. What prompted you to include that?
Well, yeah, thank you. I guess the badge, if one can manage this, I can manage anything, can be disputed by mothers of 3 and more kids. But anyway, what I often hear from women is that they feel that their maternity leave can, in one way or another, be used against them at some point. For example, by being overlooked as candidates for hiring or promotion. I also hear, actually, both from men and women, that when they want to make a career change, they see it as if they're starting from zero. And, in some ways it's true, because for example, you may not have the network in the field where you are starting. But on the skill level, it's very often not true. Let me just give you an example, which I assume many mothers of 2 and more kids can relate to. Your toddler is having a full-blown tantrum. Your baby, whom you're carrying, is crying because they're overtired and desperately need to sleep, but they just can't do that because it's simply too loud. And all of this is happening at an airport, and a flight is delayed. So you are also trying to stay alert for boarding announcements while managing all of the other things at once. So if in that situation, if you manage to stay calm, regulate your own emotions, and find solutions in the middle of this kind of chaos, you are developing remarkable capabilities. Every situation like this strengthens your ability to self-regulate, to think creatively under pressure, adapt quickly, and solve problems as they come in real time. And actually, these are exactly the kinds of skills business badly needs. And if I were to give a personal example, my years as an opera soloist, it taught me like a great lot about holding my presence in front of an audience, any audience of any size. And this is a skill that I constantly use in my role as a DI leader. So because of that, in the DI field, we talk very much about transferable skills. That is, abilities that can be applied effectively across different roles. And I kind of, in my LinkedIn profile, I wanted to role model this thinking into others.
So we already started touching upon this topic of work-life balance because you mentioned some of these transferable skills. And let me maybe start with a definition. The way I like to think about it is just it's this harmony between your professional responsibilities and your personal life. And that shows up in having time and energy for work, family, friends, and personal interests, and being satisfied with both work and life. So, my first question to you is what does work life balance mean to you? And when do you know that you have it?
Well, to me, I love my work. Some might even call me a workaholic. So for me, the challenge is not that, but yes, for me, the challenge is not that I love my work more than my family or my family more than my work. One can say that I'm equally passionate and equally ambitious about both. I want to be present in my kids' lives. I want to have real relationships with them and with my husband. And I also genuinely want to make a difference at work. So for me, when do I know that I have work-life balance? I know that if I feel that it's safe for me to choose when, where, and how I work best and also take care of my family best. I recently talked to my colleague from Health and Safety, and we discussed this term work-life balance in the context of the CSRD. That is the European Union Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive for our listeners who may not have heard about it, which we both work and report on. And yeah, in plain words, it's a European law that requires large companies to report publicly, not only on their finances, but also on how they affect people and the planet, including how they treat their own employees. So we discussed this term, work-life balance, and we talked that for some in the field, this term may even feel a little bit old-fashioned and outdated because it kind of creates this this dichotomy that there is work on one side and life on the other side, and you have to kind of score points on either this side or this side. So there are alternative definitions that start circulating right now. One of them is sustainable work. And this definition, sustainable work, that appeals to me because I do not want to choose between work and personal life. I want both to be sustainable in the long run.
I love this new name for the concept. Like the concept has been evolving for sure. For me, when I was researching for this episode, I looked at, for example, Global Index, which actually is Life-Work Balance Index. So we put the life first, work doesn't go first. Some people also use this work-life integration as a concept as well. So again, highlighting what is important in it. I want to ask you also about one thing. So I know that you live in Sweden and you work in Denmark, and today we'll focus
That's
on
correct.
the Danish culture. But I know that like every day you're traveling from Malmo to Copenhagen and you're crossing this bridge.
Yes.
So you mentioned kind of like already that you don't separate it so much, but I have this image of you crossing this bridge every day. So would you say that when you cross the bridge and you go into Denmark, do you shift and focus on work? How does it work for you?
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. I've never thought about this way, but I think that for sure some shift does happen because it's actually quite interesting that I've noticed quite often that the weather changes. You don't expect it because you kind of, okay, you go 1 kilometer, 2 kilometers, but then over the bridge, there's very often it was sunny on the Swedish side, then it's raining on the Danish side, and vice versa. So it's definitely kind of a shift. And I usually do analysis, especially on the way back, analysis and summary of the day at work. And it definitely helps me then shift when I am on the other side because I kind of, okay, I'm done with it. I'm done. And then I'm ready for something else.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Nowadays, a lot of us work from home, or some of us work from home, and then unfortunately, you don't have such a clear separation oftentimes. So I think even more important to think about this as sustainable work.
indeed.
So let's start exploring this perspective of Denmark, of the Danish culture in general. What would you say are the expectations and the norms around sustainable work or work-life balance in Denmark?
Now that we start talking about it, I think that we should kind of keep two things in mind at the same time. So there is this one side, and this is the legislation framework. And in that respect, we should mention that European Union passed the Work-Life Balance Directive in 2019, and it is in force across member states since 2022. And what it does, it sets minimum family leave rights for the whole European Union. As an example, I can give, for example, at least 10 days of paternity leave around the birth, which has to be paid at sick pay level or better, and then 4 months of parental leave per parent, of which 2 months are not transferable between the parents. And then there are other points there. And there is actually protection from dismissal or unfavorable treatment for using any of it. The thing that I mentioned earlier about the fears that some people have around taking those breaks. So this directive has in many ways leveled the legislative playing field across member states. And work-life balance policies have become much more aligned across the European Union. But then there is this other cultural level that is probably more interesting for us today, which is around norms and expectations which society puts on its members, right? Okay, what are the expectations? How much leave is okay to take? How many breaks is okay to take? And it depends, of course, for every society, for every culture, it depends on also on the gender, as you very well know, on gender, on role, on your age. And as far as Denmark is concerned, I can say that generally one can see that there is a stricter line between work time and personal time than in other parts of the world. And people tend to be protective of their time outside working hours. And they can do that by, for example, actively choosing to be out of reach, or at least, not feeling obliged to answer right away and having this inner right to decide for themselves whether something is urgent and I will choose to reply, or it can wait. I would also say that there is greater freedom and greater trust in general for people to be able to choose themselves what works best for them as long as they deliver on their tasks. For example, if somebody needs to leave at 3 o'clock for some errands, then they can put some extra couple of hours in the evening instead, and that's fine. And there is also a general expectation that you yourself are able to communicate your needs and preferences and say, I need this, or my preference is this. But this also has to be put inside a global trend, which I have started seeing in both Sweden and Denmark, which kind of goes in the opposite direction, right? That many companies, many big companies are making the decision to bring their employees back to the offices, including in Denmark and Sweden. IKEA, big banks in both Sweden and Denmark, Maersk, Novo Nordisk. And this, of course, hits hardest people with caring responsibilities, neurodiverse individuals, or anyone with a long commute who simply lose the time and energy they spend on travel instead of putting it into the work itself.
So you have this kind of, you say that you kind of protect your time outside of work and you're making decisions about, when you're available and when you're not available. Where is it coming from? Like, what would you say? Why this is important to be able to say, okay, I'm not reachable, or after 5, I don't know, I'm not checking my emails. I'm not going to respond.
This is a really good question because, as you also know, working with culture requires not only taking notice of the norms and expectations, but also trying to find the logic. The logic is always there, right? And there is always a reason. Because of that, I really think it's a very important question. So I believe that part of the roots behind this can be found in Protestantism, which, as we all know, arose as a reaction against Catholicism with its papal authority and its concentration of power in one person. And Luther's priesthood of all believers means a direct relationship with God without intermediaries. So basically, everyone is equal before God, and you yourself, nobody can tell you what to do. You yourself have your own direct dialogue with God, with no one standing between, and you decide with your moral standards what's right and wrong, and you will answer before God, but not before somebody else. So I think this expectation around, and also that it's okay that I myself take this decision, make this decision that, okay, I'm out of reach because I still consider myself as loyal to the business, hardworking. I will answer it when I come back, but I make this decision. So I think that it comes from that. And then there is probably also quite long egalitarian tradition in Scandinavia. There is this tradition of free land owning farmers, which also had a political voice through local assemblies, ting, and there was slavery, but there was no feudal serfdom of the kind that shaped much of the rest of Europe. So I see these two things as the roots that may be driving this behavior.
So I'm always asking about the values because actually it's in this different logics that governs our behaviors. There's a lot of conflicts, miscommunication, misunderstandings.
Yes.
So, for example, if you have this logic or the mindset of, okay, I am taking decisions about my work, I know the best what I need to say it, I need to communicate it, and then I am making the decisions. So that's kind of the logic behind maybe not, let's say, finishing at a certain time and not treating something as urgent if it's outside of your working hours. Sometimes in the countries that have a bit of a different perspective, so a lot of Catholic Europe, for example, or more hierarchical countries or countries where like you think more about kind of the group, this kind of boundary between what you need to do and, what you have to do is a little bit different. So there's a different logic around that. Let's dig deeper into kind of how this looks like in the workplace where different expectations play out. So in your years of working as a consultant and even now as a global DEI leader, which tensions around work-life balance came up the most, especially when Danes are collaborating with colleagues from other parts of the world?
I think that you raised a very good point by pointing back to the logic and how it can be misinterpreted, right? Because you don't see the logic of the other. So you put your own stick yard to it. Because of that, I think that what I've seen has been around three things. Because you don't know the logic, you don't know the reality, the other reality, how the reality looks like in a different country. Very often in global companies, although these are companies which usually have experience of working with other companies, we can still see some lack of planning around the different leaves, for example. We still need to remind our employees, new and old, about how important it is, for example, Lunar New Year in China or Eid in Muslim countries, and then summer vacation in Denmark and the rest of Scandinavia, that people will not be, it will be much more difficult to reach them, and we cannot expect. So we need to plan the business, we need to plan the deliverables accordingly. But this is actually, this first thing is very practical and it's the easiest one to solve. Then there are some deeper things. And the next one is about fairness. Because in business, what very often happens is that when someone works less, someone else has to work more. And even when there is no this direct dependency, so you're not working together. So if somebody is not working after 5, you have to finish their work. Even if there is no direct dependency, there is still a kind of a sense of fairness that can create invisible tension. If you know that in your country you're only allowed to take 2 weeks vacation, but in other countries there are 5 weeks vacation, of course it irritates your own feeling of fairness inside. And then there are values, and I think that you have already touched upon it. Sometimes, especially in tight, high-paced collaboration, for example, between project management and production in product teams, all the stress, all the tension and frustration starts touching deeper values. Let me give you an example. I meet teams who talk about lack of correct prioritization in a project, which leads to missed deliverables, for example. But when we dig deeper into that, what it then turns out to be really about is about dislike, one can say dislike of behavior on the opposite side, because it touches some deeper concepts, for example, diligence. Like, honestly, I start hearing this, honestly, they're just not working as hard as we do. This concept of diligence, what does it mean to be hardworking? How does it show that you are hardworking? And then loyalty, for example, why don't they try a little harder for the team's sake? Why don't they do this for the team's sake? They're only thinking about themselves. Then it can touch upon respect. How come that my time is worth less than yours, for example? So it's because of that these conflicts can feel really personal, because they touch our deeper beliefs and values. Who is a good leader? Who is a good teammate? What does it mean to be hardworking?
Can you walk us through the real situation? What happened, what was read, and how it played out?
Yes, absolutely. I've already touched upon this project management and production team, and that's actually a very real example. Unfortunately, I will not be able, out of confidentiality, to say which countries it touches upon, but that's a project that I have worked with in an important production line, which started as frustration around behaviors and which actually we could see that it had very concrete consequences. And the consequences that you see when you work in these situations are around turnover, burnout rates. So when you start, and that's where usually HR picks up. What I mean with HR business partners. That's where the touch point between me and business partners usually comes, because they come to me and see, okay, we see these tendencies that in that team, the turnover is unusually high, or there have been a lot of missed deliverables. And because of that, there is so much frustration and people are taking sick leave. That's where we start digging into what's lying behind, because the frustration that usually dictates that the people do not have good chemistry, yes, it may be true, but behind good chemistry is usually what we've discussed. It's the conflict between values, the conflict between interpretations of those behaviors. So what needs to be done is to very often create a kind of a third culture. When you work cross-regionally, when you work cross-culturally, you cannot allow some norms to be dominating or a complete chaos of norms. You still need norms, so you need to decide on them. And then different sides will have to compromise. But when there is a good understanding of what are our norms in the team, that's where usually a turning point is.
Yes, I think the biggest challenge is that teams have different norms and they're not surface. So everyone is operating according to different logic and everyone interprets the behaviors of others according to a different logic.
Yes.
I'm thinking about the Polish culture. So with the Polish culture, oftentimes when I'm comparing it to either Western European countries or, for example, when I'm comparing it to North America or maybe some Asian countries, like on most of the dimensions of cultures that you would typically pick, Poland is kind of in the middle. So oftentimes we have challenges on both sides in a way. For example, some Polish teams, when they work with teams from Scandinavia, the surprise is, I think, the amount of planning and the amount of time things take. And I think a lot of Polish teams would have this approach of, okay, we'll just make it happen. I like how you mentioned also at the beginning the political structure or the policies. Europeans still, compared to a lot of Asian countries, certainly North American countries, we have a lot of vacation time, relatively.
Yeah.
And it's not a benefit, it's a right. So we have some legal frameworks that protect that. So again, like talking about holidays for team members who might have maybe a week vacation or 2 weeks vacation creates this feeling of unfairness and this feeling of you don't work, right?
Very, very true.
So from your experience, what people tend to get wrong when they work with Danish colleagues? And what do Danish colleagues misinterpret about their international team members?
Well, it's something that I very, very briefly touched upon. It's the realities, right? So I think it's very much about understanding the realities of others. And of course, as you say, we understand that politics differs between countries. We understand that legislation differs too. But what we very often miss is that the social fabric is also different. You know, all the social ties, the expectations around behavior and how the society interprets different roles. So these two are in constant interplay. They either reflect each other or in conflict with each other, laws and policies on one side, and then roles and social identities on the other. Let me explain what I mean. So, for example, in many countries, grandparents are expected to, and also expect themselves to play an active, quite central role in caring for the kids. Probably a more active role than they typically do in Sweden or in Denmark. And if you have that support system behind you, a meeting that is scheduled after daycare closes is not a crisis because someone is there, which means that picking up the kids from daycare can be a perfectly valid reason to decline a meeting in one culture and barely a reason at all in another country. So here is this thing. We almost never see each other's realities. We only see the behavior. We only see that the Danish colleagues are walking out at 3 o'clock and the colleague elsewhere happily is taking the 5 o'clock call. And when the reality behind the behavior is invisible, we fall back on our own cultural yardstick to judge it. So again, what does a committed employee look like from where I come from? Yeah.
You actually are bringing, I think, a central topic also to the discussion, which is gender and gender roles, right? Because when you think about, and at the beginning, this concept of work-life balance, the idea is that, you know, you have work and then you have this boundary and then you have life, which is leisure as well, right? But then as the societies were changing and more women entered the workplace, the research on that and thinking about it has changed. What I find really also interesting in discussing work-life balance is thinking about it on the societal level. And there's this framework actually designed by a Danish sociologist that classifies countries based on how they answer this question: who provides support for life outside of work? So you would have, you know, conservative states in which family provide support. So your example of grandparents, for example. And in a lot of places, this is also grandmothers, to be honest. So family, more hierarchical countries, more defined gender roles.
Yes.
You have liberal societies. So, for example, US, Canada, Australia, where the market is supposed to provide support. And then you have countries like Denmark, which are socio-democratic countries where the state in some ways provides support, right? So then you have all of those regulations, you have a daycare and kind of, so very different realities. So who actually provides supports to the family? The market, the state, or the family would really impact actually the options that people have.
That's brilliant. That's brilliant and very true. Very true too. And that impacts, again, it goes back and it touches upon our interpretation, right? Because this hardworking, the thing that we have already been talking about. So what do you actually do to be seen as hard work in the different countries, right? Because in some countries, it's long hours. It's your availability, that you are available, that you are showing your face at team events outside of working hours. And in Denmark, it will be almost the opposite. And I think that when internationals start working in Denmark, that's what they need to figure out, that they show that they are committed employees, not by working that much. For example,
Time-wise.
staying, time-wise, but being hardworking means delivering efficiently within the agreed hours. So you need to show how efficient you can be within the agreed framework. So it's same word, but it completely different performances. And that's exactly where the mutual misreading usually happens.
So actually, if I want to show that I'm hardworking and I'm staying longer hours, my colleagues would think that I'm inefficient rather than hardworking, oftentimes.
It can be a risk of such an interpretation.
I like this example of hardworking. So one of the things that I do intercultural coaching, and I would ask people about what are the 3 top qualities of a good team member for you. And then I ask them to describe it in behaviors. And hardworking comes up quite a bit. And then some people would say, you stay long hours. If something needs to be done, you just complete it. So, like you show up like this. And the other person would say, it's actually not about staying long hours. It's about the results. So getting your targets or exceeding your targets. Very different interpretations, very different approaches.
Indeed.
So when I'm thinking about the Danish approach to work-life balance, this pretty clear, I think, in some ways, expectations and needs and rights that you have around your life outside of work. It sounds really good for, I'm sure, a lot of listeners, but I'm wondering if it has its blind spot, or who does it work less for, or are people in Denmark who are maybe excluded from this type of balance, or is it harder for them to access it?
Definitely, every system always has its blind spots. So foreigners is one of the groups, because if you don't have access, you talked about 3 different support systems. If you are not in the system, if you're outside the system, that means that you're lacking support as well, right? And even if you're a foreigner, you are very much dependent on knowing where to get support and how to get support. But then there are some unusual groups that you may probably not think about in the first place. For example, LGBTQ plus community. And let me give you a real example. And again, as most of my examples are confidential, so I will not be able to say company or name, but we can start by saying that Denmark is generally considered as one of the countries where the LGBTQ plus community has the most rights and the most comfortable life. And precisely because of that, we kind of stop thinking about some challenges that this community may still have. We know that in Denmark, gay and lesbian couples can marry, they can have kids. In fact, Denmark was the first country in the world to legally recognize same-sex couple marriages, which can seem like a paradise to many members of the global LGBTQ plus community. But I have this story. I met someone and he told me his story, that because he was not the official legal father of the one child he and his partner have in their rainbow family, he could never take a single day of child sick leave. So he was always dependent on a good relationship with his current manager, someone he could talk to and ask to work from home, for example. So yes, you can marry the person you love, you can start your family, you can have kids, but then you cannot take sick leave for your
Mhm.
kid. And we all know that, I mean, kids are sick a lot during their first years. And I must say that from January 1st, 2025, so it's very recent, there have been changes to the Children's Act and which made it possible to register both intended parents as legal parents of a child. And then there is another bit. Since January 2024, in Denmark, parental leave in rainbow families can be shared between up to 4 parents. The 2 legal parents plus 2 so-called social parents. Both these bits of legislation recognized the challenge that existed for these families. And, well, it means that legislation is catching up. But to be able to discover this is very important. And this is just one example of what we may not be even thinking about because we are so sure that the rights are there. And then there is another group, and it's, of course, the self-employed, because, well, much of the Danish model paid collectively agreed working hours, vacation cover, etc. It's built around being an employee. And if you run your own business, the
That,
norms that protect you far less.
that doesn't apply to you. Thank you for those examples. So, for someone leading a team or working with Danish colleagues, along with people from very different work cultures, what actually helps? What have you seen work?
It's an important question, and there are different answers to it. I think that what usually comes outside the radar is the HQ versus regional office dynamic. So it comes on kind of on top of cultural differences. Because if we say that the HQ is in Denmark and we have a team with a Danish leader, and then there are other nationalities on the team, what I have seen is that in the majority of cases, regional offices and then other nationalities, if it's one team, they will adapt willingly or unwillingly. There is, of course, a cost. It comes at a cost because if you do something that, well, that doesn't come natural to you, that comes against probably some of your values, you need to spend energy on monitoring yourself, on how you adapt. It means that you spend less energy on being creative, on being free to think and do the best work possible. So there is definitely a cost associated to that. There is a much more difficult situation is when the headquarters is, for example, in Denmark, but the team leader and the division that the team leader is responsible for sits in a different country. With an international team, that includes Danes, because the willingness to adapt is much less. And I think because the headquarter behavior naturally tends to dominate. So in this situation, again, awareness of those different realities helps a lot so that we avoid coming to the situation where people start labeling each other as not hardworking enough or not committed enough or as overstepping each other's work-life boundaries.
I want to come back to something that you mentioned before because I think it's a key, this really surfacing the norms in a team and deciding what works the best, taking into consideration people's reality, which might be really, really different, and then agreeing, okay, how are we going to work together? What makes sense? There's one other aspect of, I think, work-life balance that I want to ask or discuss with you. It's this friendships at work. I think it's quite connected because you have cultures in which, the way you develop trust is through getting to know the person, or there are cultures in which you develop trust by just completing the task and the personal relationship is not that important. Poland falls kind of in the middle. So we expect some kind of interactions with colleagues. We develop trust by knowing them a little bit more in general as a country. How does it look like in Denmark?
Oh, Anna, this is such a good question. I mean, you remember from human mental programming that, we all have these human qualities. We're all human beings. So social interaction, trust, relationships is important for all of us. But I think what I hear a lot from internationals, and actually the statistics for Denmark is not very encouraging. Denmark, and that's what I hear at a lot of conferences and in events when we're talking about attracting and actually keeping international talent. So attracting international talent to Denmark is usually not a problem, but keeping international talent for more than, for example, 3 years is usually more challenging. And looking at surveys for expats, it usually shows that it's difficult to stay in Denmark because of the relationships, because of the friendships, because of building those close ties, both at work and outside work, which probably is quoted as one of the biggest reasons why people decide to move back or move to another country. So I kind of recognize that there is a big challenge for many of expats, many internationals. But I also know that, the challenge isn't rituals. It's how you build those friendships. It's not that they do not exist, but it's how you do this. Basically, in what order do you do things? And I can give you an example that, for example, the culture where I was born in Belarus, what you do is you connect through a deep conversation. A deep conversation, it means opening up, showing a little bit of your vulnerable side. It's probably about, your aunt who is, I don't know, having sleeping problems, or I don't know, something that is outside of working context. And you connect through that conversation. You connect to one person and you start exploring hobbies, interests, something together that binds you as two persons. But in Sweden and in Denmark, this is not the ritual. That's not what you do. You connect through doing things together. So when you do things together and you show that I can rely on you, that's how you behave in a stressful situation. That's where you flip out or do not flip out. That's where you can self-regulate or cannot self-regulate. That's where you will let me down or not let me down. So when you do things together, only after that, those deep conversations happen, not before. While in my culture, the ritual is that you start with a deep conversation and then you start exploring what you can do together. So that's like a very primitive example, and I really try to put it in very simple words, but I hope it illustrates a little bit that it's not about lack of interest in building personal relationships, but it's rather about completely different approaches to building relationships.
No, great example. And I think Poland would be much more like your home country in that we do also build this trust by sharing something outside of work, as opposed to maybe doing something together, like in Denmark. So we've covered a lot of ground today, and I'm just so pleased that I got to talk to you about that. And to summarize it in some ways, or to kind of leave the listeners with few things, or maybe just one things to generally rethink about how they approach work-life balance. If you were to choose this one thing, what would that be?
I think that it's probably not the easiest advice, but it's definitely what I consider the most effective one. And it's to dig deeper, to understand what's behind, not to take it at face value. Whatever behavior you meet, whatever norm you meet, do not take it at face value. Try to understand what's behind. And then there are, of course, practical applications on how can you do it as if you're part of HR or if you are a business leader. And then, we can talk about how organizations can work with work-life balance or what business can do. And there are different ways to go there. I can either strive for, talking about global minimum or team minimum. And it's actually quite difficult to solve in practice. Me now being part of HR, I understand how difficult it is to bring different legislation, different policies under one roof. And it's because of that in most organizations, there are local policies around annual leave, around sick leave, parental leave, etc. But then there is this other, no less important, is to understand this local reality, not take it at face value, and because usually HR is tasked with, making sense of the local legislation, but not having the full picture. And as an example, I can give, for example, if we understand how the reality looks like in the US, then we, for example, around the parental leave, which we have talked about so much in this episode, when mothers are pushed back to work within weeks of giving birth and there is no federal paid maternity leave and childcare can be quite expensive, then it would be of great help to, for example, arrange on-site daycare. And this is something that would not be relevant at all for Scandinavian countries. There, what you need to do is different. So this is a concrete example of not taking it at face value, but understanding what is the reality and trying to discover those imbalances and try to correct them.
I love this example. Thank you for that. So not only on the kind of individual level when you work with a team, but also on organizational level, when you design policies, understanding the context, and only then designing something that actually works and helps a specific group.
Yeah, definitely.
Awesome. Wonderful. Katja, you gave me so many things to think about and rethink. So thank you. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you, Anna.
Awesome. I usually ask this question as a last one. Like, what was the most valuable thing you took away from this conversation?
I think that talking about the topic of culture with different people, with you, I again and again see and come to the same conclusion, which is also my takeaway from today's conversation, that it's believing and making an effort to see that people do not, in majority of situations, not in all situations, but in the majority of situations, people do not mean bad, but there is a different world in the head of others. There is a different world, different reality, and it's so fascinating to try to understand it. So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to try to once again try to do that, understand how different it can be. For your examples about Poland, that was very valuable for me.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I have to say that I love exploring the logic that people have in their heads, and especially if it's very different from the way I think. So yeah, that was great for me too. Thank you so much, Katja, and listeners, thank you for listening to the episode. I'll see you next month when we'll talk about leadership from the perspective of China. If you like the podcast, follow it, share it with your colleagues, and see you next month.